Oh, are you ready for the another wonderful session? Uh, this is our last segment of the day, and then it is a panel discussion on local initiative and practical approaches. And then the Reverend McNeil will be a discussant, and Professor Mursid is a facilitator of this session.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. So first, let me introduce our panelists. You already met Reverend McNeil. We then have Dr. Samina Raja, who is Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the School of Architecture and Planning at UB. She runs one of the country's only academic labs devoted to food systems planning and also leads Growing Food Connections, which is a $4 million National Institute of Food and Agriculture funded research initiative that helps local governments create plans and policies promoting access to healthy food for everyone. And then we have Deanna Eason from Housing Opportunity Made Equal. She is Executive Director and is committed to their mission to ensure that people are able to live where they want to live, unhindered by discrimination. And then we have from WEDI, Bob Doyle, who is Community Development Director with a decade's worth of experience in restaurant and nonprofits in Buffalo. And last but not least, of course, we have Yanush Sanmugaraia, who is Program Director at WEDI with tons of experience in technology, development, and design. And here's a fun fact, and it's funny that I only have fun fact about one person, but still, he was only 12 when he built an online self-sustaining community for teenagers, which is apparently still active. Welcome. So my first question is that, through your work, you have created social interventions that address what we term social determinants of health, housing, economic stability, and...
Slower and louder.
Sure. Well, let me sort of get the mic closer, I guess. So through your work, you have created social interventions that address what we term social determinants of health, housing, economic stability, and food access. How did you get started on this journey? And we'll start with whoever wants to go first.
Well, Home was founded in 1963, and it was established when a group of concerned citizens thought that it wasn't fair that people of color could not live in certain areas of Buffalo, could not live in surrounding suburbs. So they got together, and it was a volunteer organization to begin with. And this was in 1963, so it was 5 years prior to the signing of the Fair Housing Law. So they realized there was a problem, something needs to be done about it, but it was a legal problem at that time. It was government policy that allowed for people to be discriminated against based on their race and color. And they said, we've got to put a stop to this. And that's how the agency came about. Now, I joined the agency in 2000. Wasn't even around, believe me, when it was founded in 1963. But I was hired to be a mobility counselor. And as a result of a lawsuit, Comer v. Cisneros, persons were being denied subsidies to move to certain areas or to live in certain housing complexes. They were being steered to, this is where all the African Americans should stay. This is where all of the Hispanics should live. And section here is only for white people. And as a result of this situation, there was a lawsuit, and then I was hired because Home was selected as one of the agencies to run this community housing center. And so I was tasked with helping citizens or individuals who just received Section 8 vouchers locate areas of opportunity in which to live. So that's how I got started in this, just helping low-income people, trying to right these wrongs, these governmental policies that were put into play, and just to try to see how Home can help reverse these policies.
So WEDI got started, I would say probably like mid-2000s, just as kind of like a small group of concerned community stakeholders, mostly from the Westminster Presbyterian Church on Delaware, with David Rivera and some other local stakeholders on the west side, as a way to kind of find ways to improve quality of life for people in the neighborhood. They kind of ended up leaning more on economic development, I think, with the development of West Side Bazaar. Is everybody familiar with West Side Bazaar? We made your lunch for today, too, so I hope you liked it. But really, we just wanted to find a way for people in the neighborhood that have skills and entrepreneurial skills to put those skills to use. And we really found people were not able to navigate a lot of the systems in the US, so that's kind of why we exist, to help people navigate those systems and kind of figure out, you know, how to take their idea of entrepreneurship and actually make it happen. And then I guess what brought me to it, I was working with the Somali refugee community on the West Side. My family's all from the West Side. And we were doing a lot with community gardens and teaching people how to grow food in the United States. A lot of people were wondering why things they were used to eating back home were not growing in Buffalo. So we worked a little bit on, you know, how to grow things here, what you can actually grow, how to make sure you're doing it safely. And I've been working in restaurants for a really long time. And at a certain point, just kind of was like, why am I working for people who are already millionaires when I can help people who are not, like, you know, at least achieve a standard of living that's out of poverty. So I guess that's what.
So WEDI has 3 different programs. We have a economic development program, which focuses on business counseling, business education, and microlending. We have our community development program, which operates the West Side Bazaar, and this year we're also expanding into operating the kitchen at the market, Broadway Market. And we have an education program which focuses on English language learning and STEM learning for elementary, middle, and high school students, primarily refugee students. All of our programs are really aimed at filling a gap in the community. There are gaps in all 3 of those areas. There's a lack of affordable commercial space for low-income entrepreneurs. There's a big gap in low-income individuals being able to access capital from traditional financial institutions. So banks, even other nonprofit lenders, low-income communities are still on the fringe of where their credit boxes allow them to access credit. And there is a big gap in the refugee and English as a second language community, those students being able to access or be at the same level as their peers in school. So all of our programs are really aimed at filling those gaps that currently exist in the communities. So that's just a little, that's kind of how we started on this journey. We're looking at filling gaps that currently exist in this community.
He didn't answer your question.
I got started at WEDI, and I mean, I had an interest in microfinance. I finished college 3 years ago, and I finished my entire senior year was all about microfinance in foreign country or developing countries and how that's used as a model for developing impoverished neighborhoods. Well, that's what I was looking at bringing here to Buffalo, using that same model to develop some of the impoverished neighborhoods in Buffalo, particularly on the east side, west side neighborhoods. So I had that interest, which is what brought me into this work. And I'm not too experienced in it. I've only been doing it for 3 years, but yeah, that's what brought me here.
We need to talk. Do you know I do a ton of work on microfinance? Yes. After this. Samina.
Thanks first for organizing, and I'm sorry I showed up middle of the session. I agreed to do this because I wanted to hear all these stories, so I'm really excited to be here. To answer your question, I have a short view and a long view. I'll start with the long view, which is that I grew up in Kashmir. If you don't know where that is, Kashmir, the fabric, is actually referring to a place and a people. So if you know Kashmir, you really know Kashmir. It's a mountainous region between India, Pakistan, and China, and a site of great conflict. And I trained as a civil engineer, and much like what Bob shared, I was asked to design fancy hotels when people's homes were getting bombed and people were dying on the streets. So there was some logical dissonance in my head. Why was this happening? So that got me thinking that engineering isn't quite what it's made out to be. Maybe I should be a planner. And somehow that brought me to the United States. And bizarrely, as an urban planning student and a professor, well, at the time I was a student, I learned that cities and regions value land for the taxes that they generate, and they call it the highest and best use of land, but not whether that land can produce food. And last time I checked, none of us could live without food, but we could all live without taxes or money, etc. So there was another logical dissonance. Here I am. I thought I had escaped one logical dissonance, but I ended up with another one. So that's the long view. Short version is what brought me, I think, to this table is that Buffalo was extraordinarily loving to me as a scholar and a wonderful community to learn in. So I've had the pleasure of growing a research lab that I think is not because of my journey. I think Buffalo brought it to where it is. I just ran into one person, Deirdre, who's right there, and she and I were just chatting that she and I met maybe a dozen years ago in Buffalo working with Massachusetts Avenue Project. So short answer is, I don't think it's my journey. Somehow other people pulled me to it.
Wow. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about policy. Well, the policy change that you've talked about or that you envision. And so, Samina's work is, broadly defined is on food policy at this moment. Deanna's work with home mandates fair housing. And did you still not hear me? Maybe this will help. Okay. All right, I'm just going to do this. No, not that close. Okay, so Deanna's work is on with home mandates fair housing, and Weedy promotes economic and, as we just heard, other forms of self-sufficiency. So how do you feel, or to what extent do you feel that you've been able to inform local government policy in your areas of work? If you have, that is.
So we basically try to build relationships with government institutions because it's a little bit easier to get somebody's ear when you kind of have a relationship with people in the room. So one thing that we've really wanted to kind of work on is things with the older senior citizen populations in the refugee community. There's a lot of issues with food access and then also with social isolation in that community. So with things like that, we just kind of try to work with the government, and now we'll actually be starting a program with Erie County Senior Services where senior citizens in the refugee community or just in the Buffalo community in general will be able to come into West Side Bazaar and get meals that are like culturally relevant, nutritious, and then kind of provide that interaction with other people too. So I think for us, we've realized government doesn't always move like as fast or even at all as we want it to. So it's a little bit easier to kind of suggest things like that and already have like ideas in place than just being like, this is a problem. So I think that's kind of what we've found. Anybody else?
Deanna.
Municipalities that receive community block grant fundings have to meet a requirement, and that requirement is they have to use some of those funds to affirmatively further fair housing. So there are actually quite a few local government and municipalities who contract with Home to ensure that fair housing is investigated and enforced. And we have contracts with Hamburg, who has a very robust fair housing law, Amherst, Erie County, Town of Tonawanda. So, we have told these different municipalities, we will do these things. We will talk to your constituents. We will advise landlords and tenants about their rights and responsibilities under fair housing law and real property law. We will talk to people who are seeking homes to purchase, to sellers. We'll advise them of their rights as well. And we will investigate, allegations of discrimination. So in that, we really have a pretty decent relationship with most. We'll go out and we'll do presentations, we'll do educational trainings, we'll do adult education classes. things like of that nature. We worked for years to get a fair housing ordinance passed in the city of Buffalo, and we were able to get that law passed in Buffalo in May of 2006, but it didn't have teeth to it, and that's the problem that we really have been just, running into for the past 12 years. And just recently, we're really getting able finally to make certain that Buffalo is enforcing that law. We've been working with Anna Falikov at the Corporation Council, City of Buffalo, and she's been just great in the past, year and a half. We've been able to get justice for folks who've been denied housing based on source of income in the City of Buffalo. So it's slowly but surely in Buffalo, and we've worked for maybe 4 or 5 years with the Erie County Fair Housing Partnership and former Erie County legislator Betty Jean Grant for a passage of an Erie County Fair Housing Law. And just last May, we have that law. So now source of income, along with race, color, discrimination, disability, and the other protected classes, source of income is protected in all of Erie County, which is wonderful. It's fantastic. So, little by little, and now onward and upward, we want state protection. So that's what we've got so far locally.
I think we all play different roles in the policy world. In my case, because we're a research lab at the university, one of the jobs that I think we have is to lift up the work that community groups and organizations are already doing and use that as an illustration of why policy ought to change. So in my head, policy is definitely a decision to act by local governments, but it's also a decision to not act, like not have a more strong ordinance. So my personal observation is that, yes, we've had success in the city of Buffalo, but it's not my success. I would say it's our collective success. And policy change in Buffalo has followed on the ground work of WEDI, MAP, African Heritage, Food Co-op, Grassroots Gardens, and a ton of other organizations. So in my head, yes, it's happening. It always follows grassroots change. That's how it should be. It's slow. I heard 2006 for Hamburg, right? For Buffalo. In the food world, my observation is it takes about 10 to 12 years from idea to policy change. So one example is we had a zoning ordinance in the city of Buffalo that regulates what can happen on a piece of land. Well, we had a 50-year-old zoning ordinance that disallowed agriculture in many parts of the city. And it was only recently changed. And I would say that it easily takes about 10 years from idea to change.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. We talk about policy change, and one key feature of that is incrementalism. Even though we want, immediate changes, particularly now, I suppose, but that's a good reminder. But moving on to our next question, what are ways in which you envision more collaboration with actors from the local government and community stakeholders? We'll start with WEDI and then.
So we have a few collaboratives at WEDI going on. We work with a lot with the other organizations similar to us, other nonprofits that are doing lending here in Buffalo. One of the initiatives or one of the collaboratives has been gathering a lot of feedback from the entrepreneurial community on which has actually lacked a lot, especially from the minority and women-led firm community in Buffalo. What are some things that they would like to see more in the business community, specifically for low-income business communities? Through our collaborative efforts, we've seen some initiatives like Assemblyman Sean Ryan. He does every month he'll meet with the business owners in the Grant Ferry Business District to go over issues. So those are some collaboratives that we're working on. I mean, we try to fill gaps in wherever we can work with people. Other organizations will work with them.
I think going along with that, we try to work with other community groups as well and build those community partnerships whenever we can. We're a small staff and we can't really do everything, and we're we're good at certain things where there's other things we're not good at. So building those relationships with other organizations, I think really allows us to fill some gaps too and really kind of learn about what partnerships are available. Like for example, we're on a food grant right now focused on local food systems, which is not something we've ever really had the chance to even go over. We work with mostly very low income entrepreneurs, and a lot of times when you're really kind of helping people set up those businesses and navigate those systems, there's not really the time to say like, oh, are you sourcing this responsibly? Or, you know, have you thought about being eco-friendly? Because really like the thought process, especially with the populations that we primarily work with, is more about survival than it is about those kind of things. So really getting into some of those partnerships has been nice to allow us to kind of focus more on that too, I think.
Yeah, just one thing that I forgot to mention, I think, just to answer the question, like how do we envision more collaboration? It's great that a lot of the organizations that are similar nonprofits that are trying to support low-income individuals are collaborating, but I think we could promote more collaboration by perhaps creating more actionable items from these collaborative meetings that we're doing. We do a lot of collaboration, but I think we know that we're all talking to each other. I think we would like to get to the next step where we can actually form some actionable items from all of the discussion that we're having.
Deanna.
I definitely agree. You know, I mean, I would say that we probably all have partners and, you know, and other organizations and agencies that we collaborate with. What I've noticed though is that people are getting the mindset, but this is my job with them, whoever the them is. And it makes it hard, you know. It's almost like we're working in separate corners of the world. So, you know, they're just like, don't, you know, knock over my apple cart. This is my service area. You know, I don't want to, you know, work too much outside of that box. And you know, we've been guilty of that too. So when you know, we run into different organizations and we say, this is the situation. I'll give you an example. Sometimes we'll deal with bad actors, and we get calls from landlords complaining about tenants. And, you know, the tenants are just horrible. And I'll say, yep, there's some bad tenants, they're good tenants. There's some bad housing providers, they're good housing providers. You know, this is how we have to start every call, just to let people know you can't talk in these sweeping generalizations. But when we do run into a bad actor, you know, a bad landlord, a lot of times we'll want to reach out to another agency and say, hey, I know you deal with this individual. Can you maybe stop using the voucher there? And that's not their problem. That's Home's problem. So, you know, I'm just like, but you see that discrimination is occurring. Discrimination is Home's problem. But serving low-income people, it's all of our problem. So if there's a way, you know, I think that's one of my biggest issues. How can we, even though this is, you know, what we're funded to do and that's what you're funded to do, but how can we bridge that gap so we can kind of look out for the client instead of focusing so much on counting widgets to put in our reports for more funding?
I don't think more needs to be said on that.
Well, yeah. Then it reminds me of, you know, we talk about interprofessional education and so on. It kind of reminded me of that, like how multiple professions should and, you know, do come together to create innovative solutions. But I will move on to the next question. And that is, you know, these problems that you work on are not just local issues. These have national import. How do you support coalition building beyond the local level? We can start with Weedy again.
All right, I'll start with this one. So we actually lately have been getting into some a little bit of consulting on the national level on this. There's a lot of organizations in cities all over the country that really want to kind of like replicate the West Side Bazaar kind of in their own city, which is not really possible because it can really only come out of the community it's in, right? So every city has different communities and, you know, different ideas. So we've kind of been trying to work together with groups in places like from Maryland. I had people come in from Columbus, Ohio today, all over just to kind of talk about what something like this would look like in their city. And then we also do a little bit of advocacy with other immigrant or refugee serving groups from other parts of Western and Central New York, so like the canal cities of Utica, Syracuse, Buffalo, that have a lot of available land and a fairly low cost of living still, to try and kind of attract a little bit more talent to these areas, just by saying, we have these support systems in place. This is a very welcoming community. The local government's kind of behind us on a lot of the initiatives with refugees and immigrants in Western New York. So kind of encouraging people in other parts of the country or even other parts of the state to look at what our governments are doing to make it kind of a more favorable environment, I guess, for people that are, born other places to come live here. How can they kind of replicate that advocacy in their own communities based on, whatever challenges they have to deal with?
Buffalo definitely doesn't need to reinvent the wheel with some of these efforts that are going on. WEDI is a CDFI, which is a community development financial institution, and that's part of a larger network. It's a national designation from the U.S. Treasury. So we are part of a wider national network where, for example, I go to a lot of conferences throughout the year in different cities, different Rust Belt cities, to see what they're doing, and things like developing risk models and how to assess the credit of low-income individuals, because we can't assess it the traditional way. We have to figure out different ways to extend credit to people. I rely a lot on how other cities are developing these models. What are some attributes of good borrowers that we could also use in models here in Buffalo? So we definitely do share ideas. I'm also really glad to say, like, a lot of, from what I've seen, like, Buffalo is actually ahead of a lot of other cities in things like collaboration. Where, like, I went to Pittsburgh, and collaboration amongst CDFIs was very, very unheard of, because in Pittsburgh they all seem to be competing. In Manhattan, they're definitely all competing. So I think being part of these larger coalitions that are nationwide have not only helped us develop better practices for what we're doing here in Buffalo, but also shown us that we're actually ahead of a lot of other cities in some ways as well.
Home is a part of the Buffalo Niagara Community Reinvestment Coalition, and it's a group, and there are a bunch of other local organizations who are also a part of this collaborative, and we're fighting for banking reform. And we've noticed, you can drive through our communities here in Buffalo and just see how differently the banks look depending on what community you are in. Some banks are just cinder blocks and bars on the windows, and you have to be buzzed in by security. Others, you can walk in and they'll offer you a cup of coffee. So, these disparities are troubling, and they're hurtful, and they're wrong. And it's not only in the way that banks are built and how they look in our communities, but it's the tools and the instruments that are offered in these communities. It's the interest rates, it's predatory lending, it's redlining. That's not a thing of the past. We had a big case here back in 2015. That was very recent. So these are things that are still going on. These are still issues where in certain communities, people aren't offered the same opportunity to purchase a house, the same opportunity to start a new life, to make a difference, to start a business. So, that's one of the coalitions that we're active with.
I think my answer is tied to an earlier question about policy change. Because policy change is so slow, for me, this is a really important question. Without coalition building, I don't think we can transform policy rapidly. We need to do that to accelerate it. I'm not a big fan of the idea of scaling up, because it just doesn't work. But for my head, it's about networking our impact and leverage across places. So the way we approach it in the UB Food Lab is really drawing on the lessons and experiences of Buffalo and then lifting them up nationally. So if folks are interested, one of the things we do is we maintain a national database, which is searchable and free, of good policies that city governments adopt across the United States. So anytime something good happens, we put it in there and then we blast it out. Then conversely, what I tactically do is I bring that information back to local governments. So I might present it to planning colleagues here or to other groups here. Bob doesn't know this, but yesterday I was talking to somebody at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization at the United Nations, and I mentioned the West Side Bazaar. So that's my tactic of taking lessons from here to out. I think it's really important. So we use a model of bridging what we call communities of innovation with communities of opportunity, which means there's a trajectory of opportunity and innovation in every place. And if we can link those places together, we're going to accelerate that change better. And I think I heard in this question maybe a little bit of a caution. If we only focus at the local government level, what happens to our beloved, if I might use the word, federal government? I think it is possible to teach upwards. My example is actually from the prior federal administration, and it came up because of what Yanush said. City of Philadelphia had a lot of neighborhoods that did not have good food access, and a local organization called the Food Trust developed a really clever financing model, and which led to the establishment of a financial package for establishing supermarkets. That Philadelphia model was then used by the Obama administration to launch a national program called Fresh Food Financing. So I guess I'm saying that to say that if we do things right at the local level, it is possible to share the lessons upward, especially because not just at the national level, but I'm learning at the international level, policymakers actually have no idea what is going on the West Side, none. The West Side is classified by the federal government as quote unquote, and I dislike this term for the record, whoever is audio taping, videotaping, West Side is labeled as a food desert. That is an obnoxious way to describe a community. West Side has lots of assets and opportunities, but it's a signal that the feds don't understand what is happening in communities.
Could you tell us what word to use instead? I know what you say, but for our audience.
I would call it a community of opportunity. I would call it a neighborhood that has incredible entrepreneurs. That doesn't overlook the challenges that exist there, but by focusing on deprivation only, we just ignore the presence of West Side Bazaar or Guerchio's or whatever else is in that neighborhood. Just because we don't have a Tops or a Wegmans doesn't mean that we can't have some alternative African heritage food co-op on the east side.
And now you are a social worker. So policy change arguably requires consent of the public, which is why it's essential to mobilize public support for policy. I guess we can agree on that. And for this reason, some believe that activists and community organizations should work on policy literacy. And that is to say, we should inform the public and communities about policy issues at stake while building their capacity for identifying, understanding, analyzing, and criticizing policy issues. So could you talk a little bit about how have you gone about educating the public? Take a few minutes to think, that's okay.
So we don't really do a lot of advocacy or any kind of, I don't know, we're not really like into trying to change policy as much as we are into trying to help people navigate the systems. And I think that's something that we've been struggling with as an organization is, do we get more involved in trying to change these systems, or do we just keep helping people try to navigate them the way that they're set up now? And I think part of what we've done is try to make people understand that the entrepreneurs we're helping are actually positively really contributing to the neighborhood. And so people are coming to this country from somewhere else. We're keeping money in our neighborhood. We're, improving the, I don't really want to say the aesthetic of the neighborhood because that sounds like it wasn't like a good place to be, but I mean, just helping to kind of revive some storefronts and, really bring a little bit of life all the time back to the neighborhood. You'd always kind of see people on Grant Street or Niagara during the day walking around. But now even at nighttime, you know, there's people all over the place. There's a little bit more activity, and really building that community of entrepreneurs where people that live in our neighborhood can afford to live there, own a business in that neighborhood, raise their kids in that neighborhood, go to a good school in that neighborhood, and really focus on how we can build like that whole community of people who are focused on the community, but you know, still able to run their own business and provide for their families through doing that. So I think we've been a little bit more focused on how to navigate policy than really advocate to change it, but that's kind of where we are with it.
We have 10 staffers, but each staffer is staffs a program of one. And that goes, that's how it is for our education and outreach person too. But what we, even more so in the past 5 years, what we have started to do is all this cross-training, because Stephen is not a machine. He can't do it all. And there are so many people who still don't know about home. It's not always a good thing to be the best kept secret when you've been around for 56 years. That's a problem, you know. So, whereas he's not the only one who does tabling. He's not the only one who does presentations. We all do now. And we've, you know, expanded our social media reach, but then there are people who don't have access. So we're talking boots on the ground access, you know, and we have to put on our home t-shirts, and we have to go out and talk to people, and we have to form relationships with community leaders, because there are a lot of newer communities who don't trust home. They don't know home, they don't trust home, and I don't want you bothering my housing because I just got over here, and if I don't have housing, you know, how am I living? What situation do I have? So don't rock the boat. You know, yes, the roof leaks. Yes, it's rat infested. I know I don't have water, but it's almost shelter, so leave me alone. So they don't really trust us. So, but when we can form that relationship with the leaders in the communities, then that helps us build that trust, and that's kind of what we've been able to do. Later on this summer, we've applied for a grant, so keep us in your thoughts and prayers. And where we actually will be able to extend our outreach to rural communities. We want to do a lot more in rural communities. We want to do a lot more with seniors, and we can't do it right now with the funds that we have. If they come into the office or if they're close enough, we can, but you can't say that you have a mission and there are people right in your area that you can't reach. So.
Again, I think this is a really important question for me, because as a researcher, if you are not participating in getting information out there, what are you really doing? So I would say, I was struck by some of the comments, which was, we don't really do policy advocacy, we're just navigating and helping people navigate. In some ways, making that transparent is also policy literacy, to me. And I rely on organizations like WEDI or MAP or others who are navigating, because they know better than anybody else what's wrong with the policy world. So my take is document, document, document. So for those of you who don't know, it was illegal to raise a chicken in the city of Buffalo until a few years ago because of a random ordinance, a law. And it was because of community partners who were always trying to actually raise a chicken under the quietly that I got involved in it. And the tactic for policy literacy, I think, is really making sure that we communicate why it matters. Because policies like the background narrator, we hear the story, but we don't actually know who's telling the story of our cities. So very practically, what do we do in the lab is every journal article that we publish, for example, or a report that we may write, we turn it into a concise policy brief. They're all publicly available and searchable that people can download and use for their own benefit. That's one tactic. The other is there are organizations in Buffalo who are doing a very good job of policy literacy. So I just want to shout out Partnership for Public Good, for example. MAPS Youth do a lot of training around the city. Open Buffalo, there's a lot of that good work happening. I don't know if everybody needs to do it, but we all need to be talking to each other.
Well, that's perfect. And now I will invite Reverend McNeil, did you want to say something? Okay. No. Well, then Reverend McNeil will be responding to our panel.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. It's really fascinating and to hear about the work that you all are doing. I'm not super familiar with Buffalo, although I have been to the West Side Bazaar. My brother and sister-in-law used to live over there. So I obviously bring a lens about movement building and organizing and systemic change. And so hearing about some of the work that you all are involved in brought to mind the term that we sometimes use of projects of survival, that in the midst of the often long-term process of trying to change these systems, we do need to be thinking about how we help people navigate the system as it is. And that those projects of survival can also be understood as that there's a way of approaching them in which we're understanding and even transparent about a theory of change that says these structures are wrong or unjust. It shouldn't be this hard for you to get X, Y, Z. Because it is, here are these programs in place to help you do that. And to also, in however much we can, to be educating people about their power as citizens. And I don't mean that as like technically citizens all the time, but that people are political actors no matter what in the communities that they live. And so understanding that they're not only the objects of policy, but can be the voices in advocating for a different policy, and also just stories and experiences that need to be further amplified for the general public, but also for policymakers and researchers, et cetera. That is a really important part of understanding how we survive and take care of each other. In terms of, I was kind of reminded of Dean Smith's point about social workers and others needing to be at the table in these conversations, and I think listening, people who are involved in these kind of grassroots and community-based projects like this often have a perspective and a lens on the actual barriers and challenges that people face that not everybody has. And too often, policymakers and elected officials have like literally no idea what's going on. And so I think it's important to think about ways that we're bringing those perspectives, and especially finding the folks who are receiving these services or amplifying the folks of the voices of the most directly impacted as much as possible. Whether that's in, how we're talking about programs to the public or whatever kind of advocacy we do, or et cetera, et cetera. And I was really struck by the conversation around like collaboration and competition, which too often happens and is such a barrier in all realms. So bringing my perspective from being in Albany and doing advocacy work, this is the time of the year at the last week of budget negotiations when most on display is how different advocacy organizations that share a lot of the same principles are not working together. And sometimes are actually working at cross purposes. And there's lots of reasons for that. One is funding. People are competing for funding. And it's a reality of how our organizations are set up, but it can't be allowed to continue to undermine the missions of our organizations. And I think that's a real challenge that we have to figure out. And I was kind of thinking of the illustration that Sam McGavin brought up earlier of the apples, and how you can dump the apples in the front of the room and the people at the back won't be able to get them. And sometimes I feel like we are in separate rooms and we have to ask somebody for our apples, and we don't know how many apples there are, and we don't know who else is in other rooms asking for the same apples. And how much better would it be if we all could get together, first of all, figure out how many apples are on offer, and strategically ask together for what we need. And if we have to ask